Hi, welcome to our next episode of CyberTangent. I'm Landon Johnson, your host for this episode, and we are joined today by Jason Morris. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So Jason is currently the Chief Technology Officer at Next Rev Technologies and also a veteran of the United States Air Force. Always enjoy thanking our veterans of the military, so thank you for your service, Jason.
No problem at all.
If I read down your bio, Jason, you're also a speaker and a consultant for designing large-scale architectures. You implement best security practices in the cloud, create near real-time image detection analytics with deep learning, develop serverless architectures to aid in ETL. That sounds like a lot of smart stuff, so I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Thanks again for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So after doing all that, you are now the CTO of Next Rev Technologies. You've seen a lot. The role of CTO has been changing rapidly over the years for obvious reasons. What do you think are some of the key changes you are seeing in this role today, in the role of CTO?
Yeah, sure. So I would say some of the key things that I'm seeing, trying to figure out the technologies passing the fluff versus functional tests, right? There's a lot of buzzwords. There's a lot of different technologies out there that seem to solve everybody's problem. I feel like blockchain gets tossed around way more than it should, right? And I feel like the role of the CTO is to kind of go through and part the sea and figure out what's actually going to benefit the customer, your engineers, the company, and what to keep an eye on as well, right? So maybe something that you're looking at right now doesn't fit the bill, but maybe in a couple of years it will, or there's a new project. So I feel like you're constantly juggling a lot of things all at once. And then also having a very cloud-focused attempt with a lot of things as well. I feel like we're progressing towards being completely in the cloud from one of the providers, AWS, Microsoft, or Google. And it's definitely an interesting time to live in since we are still having this on-prem data center concept. And then now all of a sudden folks are being told to go into the cloud for cloud migration.
People are being told to go into the cloud for cloud migration. And I've heard people also say that the cloud and cloud migration is one of the biggest tectonic changes in business since the internet itself was created. I know this is one of your passions, Jason. How do you see the shift to cloud affecting the role of the CTO and your role and your personal role?
Oh, yeah. I'll give you an example. It was interesting that when I first started out in the IT field, mainframes are still around. Solaris still had a stronghold on a lot of the actual data center. If you didn't know Solaris, you were kind of looked down upon as, well, what do you actually do? You actually don't do anything with computers. And now it's funny because if you know Solaris, it's like, well, that's great. That's 10, 12 years ago. I'm starting to see the same when we migrated to VMware, and you could tell customers and folks, hey, you can get more bang for your buck by installing virtualization on top of your machine to run multiple instances instead of just having a one-to-one mapping of servers. And now we're doing this migration of going to cloud. It's interesting to think about because a lot of folks are having issues about like data protection. Right. A lot of folks, when they think about it, they're like, well, this is my server. It's in my office, in my data center, so it must be secure. And when you think about it, you're like, well, actually, who has access to your data center? And then they'll name off, Mike, Chris, John, Jen. And you're like, well, at Amazon, for example, people that have logical access do not have physical access, right? So that's one level of security that they add. And the other thing is trying to trust this third-party provider of Amazon or so. There's a lot of folks that still kind of have that, I'm afraid to give people my data, even though it's like triple AES 256 encrypted or something. You still have those folks. And those folks have been around for a while, especially when I mentioned earlier about VMware and going to virtualization. There's always been kind of this mind frame of afraid to go.
You bring up a good point about the concept of the my server and my equipment. It seems almost at this point in time in conversation that's an old school way of thinking. But what I do know from the cybersecurity standpoint is it's a real important and real today topic, right? How, from the CTO standpoint, I see this being a key intersection of the CTO's job and the Chief Information Security Officer's job. What kind of pressure does that put on you as a CTO from a security standpoint?
Oh, yeah, great question. So I definitely say a lot. That old way of thinking of this is my server. I mean, there's an old philosophy of you would treat it as like a pet versus cattle, right? A pet, you would name your pet, you would take care of your pet. With cattle, you don't name it at all. It's just a resource. And so getting people to have that understanding of, look, this is just resources available to do my everyday task. Trying to think about the security aspect of it. I mean, there's a lot of pressure. You're now offloading your infrastructure, your compute to a provider that you don't really get to meet. You have maybe folks like solution architects and professional services, but it's a whole different way of thinking. And so you have to really become cloud smart and really like adhere to your security practices. Like you can make a simple mistake by having your root password for your AWS account saved in GitHub and then wake up the next day and someone can delete your entire company. Taking that in consideration, I mean, like no one can delete your old data center unless you have some crazy stuff going on. But, having that idea of now, wait a minute, like I have this flexibility and I have like all this compute available, but I really need to be smart about it.
You bring up some great points. So what forward-looking progressive organizations, what is and what should the role of CTO be in securing the corporate network?
Yeah, good question. I definitely say one of the things that I do is train your people. You can do all kinds of security best practices. You can read the AWS white paper until you fall asleep. You can attend sessions. But if your people are not cloud smart and they're not cloud security smart, that's a problem right there. I mean, if I'm trying to take over and attack somebody else's infrastructure, they could have everything locked down, no SSH, all the security groups and everything. But I know that so-and-so is a sysadmin. I can fish him out of passwords to get it, right? So I think it's a combination of understanding the responsibility that you have being a cloud security architect, but then also training everybody to understand of how valuable and how quick this can go from, hey, this is production to, hey, we have a serious problem.
That makes sense. That's helpful. Thank you. We're kind of skirting around a bunch of issues, but what I feel like we're getting to the heart of is cloud computing and some of the other technologies we've talked about and the intersection of the CTO's role and the security operator's role. This is really getting to the idea that technology is becoming integral to driving business strategy. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit, Jason, about how technology is driving business strategy and your role and the CTO's role in this dynamic?
So I would say one of the things I would say here is that not everything is a nail because you have a hammer, right? So thinking about, okay, I'm going to go to cloud that's going to solve all of my problems. If you have a poorly designed infrastructure or a poorly designed application, moving it to the cloud is not going to make it automatically better. The other thing is, I'd like to say, focus on the real problem, especially if you're customer focused. Don't use their time to experiment, right? So really think about, can this solve their problem? I mean, we do have the hybrid cloud concept where folks can still use their current infrastructure, but take advantage of cloud resources. And I definitely say keeping your people up to date and trained, right? So that's the number one, making sure they have the AWS certifications, making sure they're staying up to date and making sure that they're productive within the cloud space.
So I'm sure you guys at Next Rev are doing it perfectly, but let me ask you to just look across the organizations that you've been involved with before. If you could offer one bit of advice to the organization with respect to how to use the CTO and his organization best when driving business strategy, what advice would you give the typical organization? Or what would you point out as something they're not taking advantage of?
Yeah, sure. To use the CTO role, I would definitely say lean on your CTO to be the proxy between the customer, the engineers. Let your engineers fail, but fail fast. I think there's a lot of folks that are afraid of failure, but they're constantly trying to create this thing and they go all in on maybe one technology or one application and they kind of hope it works. The ability of the cloud that gives you endless resources as long as you have the money for it. I would say utilize your CTO to figure out what's fluff and what's actual functional, right? So figure out what can actually be used to solve this problem and not just some random buzzword. But then also make sure your team's smart on it and have your CTO kind of lead that vision. The folks will follow if it makes sense and everyone's agreeing on what we're doing and they can see the outcome will help the customer at the end of the day.
What's the one mistake you see with respect to how the CTO's organization is used?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say not really using the CTO in kind of an executive role. I've seen that in some places where the CTO just kind of becomes this Uber developer, the individual that's been around for 20, 25 years or so, and not really entailed into the business of things, right? So not actually meeting other executives in other companies, not doing anything of business development and understanding, where the company wants to go, the next 5 years or so. More of hey, you're a really great technical person. I want you to be this technical person to talk to other technical people. I feel like that's a failure.
So, Jason, as you know, the title of our podcast is CyberTangent. So we do like to ask tangential or lighter questions, if you will. So I have one for you. I know you'll have to forgive me because I know, as a fellow engineer myself, I know you guys like to geek out and get deep into your technology. I'm going to ask you to tap into your softer side. Okay, Jason.
Okay.
What would you say are some of the softer skills that you think are important and are critical to the success of the role of the CTO? Some of the softer skills.
Softer skills. I would say one of the softer skills that I've developed over the years, I started off as a systems engineer, super technical. Maybe 5-10 years ago, if you said, hey, you wanted to be a CTO, I'd be excited about it, but I'd be an absolute terrible CTO because I would want to do everything myself and be the rock star. I want to go and solve the problems. I want to do the new technology. I want to do the coding until 3-4 o'clock in the morning. And I think one of my soft skills has been learn how to take that and give it to your engineers and have them do it. Be there for support, be there for the vision, be there to back them up and help them, but really have to understand that everyone's in this together and let other folks grow. It reminds me of that Saturday Night Live skit, the IT guy that would try to help somebody with a computer and just yell move, right? And then do it for them. Don't be that person. And I think the other thing as a soft skill that kind of helped me is I took a tangent and became a sales engineer for a bit. And that's been really eye-opening. My whole life I've been super technical, hands on keyboard. And this was a new role where I was actually interfacing with executives, directors, and vice presidents, and it was really cool to see that side of the house because a lot of these folks are not technical, or they have some technical knowledge, super smart people, but they're not as geeky and they're not geeking out over the new technology, but they have a business need and they're looking to you to be the expert. And I think being a good CTO is kind of fostering between that, knowing how to talk to the right person and not go super technical with someone that's not.
So I heard the ability to delegate is important and communication at all levels and across functions as being important.
Yep. And then of course, always staying up to date with technology is definitely key. That's, I guess one of my biggest fears is I wake up and I'm just 5-10 years behind everything. And I don't know what the new thing is. And that kind of scares me, but I want to stay up to date on what's happening to stay within this space. And I love it. So it's awesome.
You know what? Let me just go there then. How do you, and how does one stay up on all the technologies? You're right. They're moving so fast and furious. How do you stay up on them?
Yeah. So what's really great is there's so many resources available now. Back when I was getting into this, when I was about 13 or 14, there was IRC. If you asked a dumb question, you got made fun of. I feel like that hasn't changed, but it's kind of, it's gotten a little better. But I'm still in IRC. I still use public Slack channels. The value of meetups, like meetup.com, is extremely valuable for networking. I've made a lot of close friends and also had a lot of opportunities around here just by meeting like-minded individuals. And then your standard news sites like Reddit, Quora, Hacker News. And then one of the things I like to do is I like to try to find the new technology or new framework. I like to give it a go for about a weekend. See what it does, break it, try it, how functional it is, and then kind of keep it in the back burner of my head of, hey, that was really cool. In case later on down the road, somebody has a problem, I can feel like that tool might be able to support them.
Great. Awesome resources. I wrote them down. We'll share them at the end of the podcast. So to put you on the spot, what are some of the top technologies you are, quote unquote, keeping your eye on right now?
Yeah, so a lot of the technologies I'm currently, investigating, TensorFlow and Keras is taking up a lot of my time for machine learning, doing some stuff with Druid.io for different types of data stores. Also kind of investigating Apache Spot, which is a machine learning type application that looks really cool about cybersecurity and alerting. And then there's this one application in GitHub that I just found recently called Infection Monkey, which looks like a data center security testing tool that you kind of run and tries to penetrate the network. So I kind of have a little thing going on right now where I have all this in a couple Docker containers at home, running Apache Spot against my PSN firewall to see, what's going on and try to apply some machine learning against it. And then saving off some of that data in Druid to do some of my own analytics.
So the role of the CTO, I've heard the joke also made that the T in CTO stands for transformation, probably because you and your organization are often leading the business into major transformations, whether they're business or technology transformations. One of the transformations that we keep our eye on, because it directly impacts cybersecurity and the business at the same time, is this idea of digital transformation, right? The idea that businesses and partnerships and vendor-supplier relationships are now increasingly and in an accelerated manner connected, and maybe they're almost all connected at this point in time. This also feels like it touches right at the heart of the CTO's responsibility and role. How often do you see the idea and the pressure of digital transformation pop up, and what do you see as its dynamic over the ensuing months and years?
Yeah, no, good question. I definitely would say a lot. I'm definitely seeing a lot of vendor support, talking to different corporations and companies, especially within the cloud space. It's interesting. I feel like we're kind of on this raft out in the ocean, and then you just kind of meet other people with different rafts, and you're trying to like link them all together to create this massive raft, like in Snow Crash, to have this small community of folks just doing this like massive cloud migration or understanding that. So I feel like being the CTO in the company of the digital transformation, a lot of it's also, as I said earlier, trying to kind of filter out the noise between what's buzzword, what's fluff, and then what's actually something that's going to stick around for a while. I think a lot of folks have worked with vendors or worked with open source software that became vaporware. Or for a lot of folks, it's like, oh, you know what? We'll just use this open source library. And then they find out it's deprecated and they have no support for it. And oh, by the way, it runs like 90% of their business, right? So kind of like filtering through that, maybe preventing folks from building from scratch, or finding out that building from scratch is actually the best option. So a lot of decision making that way.
Well, you bring up a good point, Jason. How well do you think the standard business executive, let's take the technology team out of the picture for now. How well do you think the standard business executive knows about the technology that's driving their business?
That's an excellent question. I would honestly go on the record and say pretty little. I've spoke with folks, and it's a little frightening when you talk to some of them that they read maybe 5 or 10 minutes of Wired magazine and they come back to their engineering team saying, hey, we need to implement blockchain. And the engineers are like, oh God, like what happened? What are we doing? Like we're a web hosting company, right? You know, and it's like trying to filter that out and help them out. But it's interesting because there's also folks that I've talked to that software developer background with a business degree. Like for example, my CEO, Charles Griffin, very technical, stays up to date with all the stuff, and also very strong business background as well. And then there's also some other companies I've worked with in the past. Some of the folks I've talked to knew more than I did, just because that they love the technology, they stayed up to date with it, they knew what made sense and what was fluff and what wasn't, and they knew what they wanted and went with it.
Okay, so then putting the pressure on the CTO role, what could the role of the CTO be in helping his or her organization climb that learning curve or stay on top of it so that it's not so scary? Because I agree, it would be scary if the business leaders don't have a fairly firm understanding of the technology that's driving their business. What could the CTO's role be?
I definitely would say training. I 100% stand behind, if you're a platform company or a professional services company, you have a product, you have to have a training team. It's just to the point now where if you're trying to go and learn something and there's no training team with it, like you're going to have a really bad time. And I feel like the CTO can definitely lead that effort, start up like, a training team of folks and then help the executives understand. And you don't have to go super deep, right? Like we don't have to have hands on keyboard, having your CEO learn them on the fly and trying to program in Python, right? Like no one has time for that. But what you do have to understand is that, there's a lot of things you can talk to the CEO that they get it. I mean, a lot of these folks been in this industry for a while. They've seen the migration, like I said earlier, from like mainframes to commodity servers to VMware to cloud. So I think a lot of it is educating them on what you're trying to accomplish. Like, for example, with cloud, it might also take negotiating and understanding that they've been maybe burned in the past before. Like maybe they went all in with a certain vendor. And now you're trying to tell them that, hey, we're going to this cloud vendor. Their experience, they're going to kick in, and you have to help them navigate through that.
Well, this has been wonderful, Jason. I guess one more question for you. How do you see your role changing over the next 2 to 3 years?
All robots. I would say artificial intelligence, right? It's funny, you say 2020, and I think about jetpacks and, like all the future, but it's actually in 2 years from now. Yeah, I would say, one of the things I see my role changing as, cloud's no longer an option. It's a standard. The fact that we even call data centers on-prem basically means that there's already something else in play, right? And so I feel by 2020, you're going to have a lot of folks that said, okay, fine, we're here. What do we do now? How do we optimize this? We migrated from A to B. We have our application. Things are working fairly well. And for the cybersecurity folks that are listening, there's going to be a huge uptick of, hey, how do I secure this thing? I'm on the cloud now, but like, what do I do? And I feel like my role is going to migrate more from convincing people to use the cloud to more of how do we optimize within the cloud space.
Well, Chief Technology Officer of Next Rev Technologies, Jason, thank you for being with us today on CyberTangent. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.